welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am here with the author of a horror novel that I am, as I was just saying before we started, I am 5 pages from the end of, and I am kind of dying, but there's no better reason to pause reading than to talk to the author himself. So let's get right into it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, my name is Neil Sharpson, and the book that is killing you is Knock Knock Open Wide.
I am really loving this book. It hits so many of my particular fondnesses. I love Irish folklore. I love stories that deal with intergenerational trauma, and I love dual timelines, and all these things are done so well. But before we get into the book itself too much, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your journey to the book, when you got into writing, and sort of the inception point of this book, perhaps.
Oh God, okay. So when I got into writing, it's like since I can remember, I've always been just kind of like coming up with stories like since I was very, very small. So I suppose how the this you're gonna regret asking this now because it's so complicated. I studied Irish folklore in college, and which shows up a lot in the book. So if you've read it, well, a lot of this is going to start sounding very familiar because the book is at least partially autobiographical. But while I was studying Irish folklore, I came across this story called Machan Deal and a Hoggart, which means the devil's son as priest, which is an incredibly dark um, fairy tale about a scholar who discovers a corpse on the road, and he has to pick up the corpse and carry it to various houses, and the corpse. I won't spoil the story, but it's a very, very messed up story, and I was like, oh my god, I need to do something with this. So I ended up turning that into a stage monologue called "A Corpse on the Road."
Mm.
Which wasn't very good. And part of the reason was because I didn't really have an ending for it. It was kind of like the ending in the original story was just kind of like it goes off, and it's quite. You couldn't really do it, I couldn't really do it justice just like a one person monologue. So I kind of put that to one side. This is basically my writing process, is just digging up stuff I wrote like 10, 15 years ago, and then finally finding something to do with it. So while that was happening, oh no, actually, like long before that happened, then a few years passed, and a friend of mine and we decided to submit a short film to RTE. That's the kind of like the national broadcaster here, and I decided to write a horror short about that's based on there was a TV show on in Ireland like 20, 30 years ago called Bosco, and I thought it would be kind of like a cool idea if you kind of like, what if Bosco was haunted? What if Bosco was about this cute little puppet who lives in a box, and said, okay, what if Bosco was actually the Slender Man? Uh, so it kind of like I wrote this short, and we kind of like we submitted it, didn't, and that was called Knock Knock Open Wide, which is actually is taken from, it was a rhyme that they used in Bosco. So it's kind of like it kind of any Irish person who hears the title of this book is like, oh, it's about Bosco. They just kind of like, it's um so I kind of like but that ended up getting going nowhere. So I had the kind of like this one, these two entirely different, so they were conceived entirely separately. And I was thinking, well, hang on, the first one didn't go anywhere because I didn't have an ending for it, and this short can't really go anywhere without me expanding on it. And then I said, because I'm just so lazy, so I ended up basically, these two entirely separate things kind of ended up fusing together. So Knock Knock Open Wide became so A Corpse on the Road kind of became the attain sequences of Knock Knock Open Wide. And so eventually I had this kind of like, and so I had the character, the first became the mother of the main character, the second, and it kind of like I was able to expand it into the kind of into this multi-generational story. So there, I told you it was complicated, but there you go.
Yeah, and that's fascinating to me, because something that I thought a lot about while I've been reading this is, sort of the strange similarities between folklore and children's media, and maybe how we remember it and the kind of position maybe that it occupies in our brains. Because as I was thinking of it, they both kind of operate by like dream logic, and our memories of them or our associations with them tend to be like very emotionally charged maybe and
Yeah.
very personal. And I'm wondering if that was something that you were kind of thinking about, the way that these stories sort of like occupy space in our lives.
Um, I wouldn't say that exactly. What it was really kind of, um, I don't know. There is a kind of, there's a slightly unsettling quality to a lot of children's media, particularly from the kind of like from the 80s.
Yeah.
Um, just it was kind of like it was an era of time where everything had to be very, very, very nice and like absolutely zero conflict. And I mean, this was true. Like this was in Irish media, in British children's media, in American children's media. There was kind of like, and that is kind of like that's something that's quite easy to kind of like to tip over into kind of like into the sinister.
Mm.
And so it's just I think it was more. It was just kind of because I studied this stuff and because I kind of like it was so kind of like getting so immersed in kind of like in changeling lore and fairy lore, that the two kind of it was just those were kind of like were two things that were very kind of like formative of me. It was just like Irish media and Irish folklore, and so it kind of like that's how they kind of like started to just kind of like to run into each other.
Mm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about perhaps the dual timelines and the two kind of levels of story that we encounter here. It's a great vehicle for when you are telling stories about intergenerational trauma, because you can sort of see how various, things get processed in between generations and how it affects family relationships and how people move around the world. So could you talk, yeah, a little bit about the two timelines and perhaps like I'm always curious about how people structure dual timelines and if they write them separately and then interweave them, or if it's written organically, switching back and forth.
So, so for the first of all, so the dual timelines kind of came about as by necessity because there were two there was two different pieces of work that kind of like ended up becoming one. So it kind of like that came out of necessity. I think it also so this is my first horror novel,
Hmm.
and I was kind of like learning a lot of there was a lot of kind of like on the job learning, and one of the thing so the structure of the book as it is now is quite different. There was a lot of shuffling around and a lot of the kind of like the order was in fact the like some of the some pretty drastic changes came out like in the final drafts, I'll tell you about when we're not at risk of spoilers, but um the I think part of it because it just kind of like came about because it's a very dual timelines are very effective for horror. Um, because okay, so you have your present timeline. You establish that something very very bad happened to a certain character, and then every time you go back in the past, the reader knows okay, it's coming, and it's a very good way of building kind of like that tension and that dread when you kind of like I don't like jump scares. I kind of like I prefer sustained menace. um and so I found that dual timelines was a very effective way of kind of generating that. You know something bad's happening, you know that it's coming, and you just have to wait there. You have to wait until it comes.
That's absolutely true. I love slow burns, and I absolutely see how, a dual timeline lets you manipulate tension and sort of like make you wait on one thing while you're also dreading this other thing coming. Um, if we could talk a little bit about the timeline that's closer to the present. It's in the late 90s into the early aughts. And it's about two characters who at the beginning are in at university. And I went to college from 2001 to 2005. So it was all extremely resonant with my experience of being a college student at that time. And I'm wondering if like some of these are the aspects maybe that were a little autobiographical. In particular, I'm wondering if there's a production of Romeo and Juliet that is described. Was that a real It's so specific? Yeah.
Yes. So there's I mean yeah, so I kind of like the problem that a problem that I kind of like made for myself, and I really it didn't have to be this way, but I was just kind of like picky or just kind of like stubborn, I guess, is that I set the earliest timeline in 1979. And why I did that for no other reason than that was the date that Bosco first started airing.
Mhm.
and and just by making that choice, I created so many problems for myself, because everything had to be, because I went to college like I think I must be just a year younger than you then, because I went from 2002 to 2006.
Mhm.
And but by choosing that 70s style, I was just putting Betty and Ashling's time in college just a few years before my own, which meant I had to do so much more research just to make sure I wasn't, even though it was just like a few years, but I had to make sure, okay, was this place still called that? Was this college society still called that? Was it still here? With, all this kind of stuff. So I made far more work for myself than I really should have. But yeah, a lot of the kind of like the theater productions that you hear about, they were those were the dram stock productions that were on those years. The people directing them were the people directing them. It wasn't exactly the same. So in the book, the production of Romeo and Juliet, they have all the Montagues played by men and all the Capulets played by women, and we didn't do that. I was cast in the production of Romeo and Juliet that was on in Dramstock. I was cast in Tybalt. I was cast as Tybalt, and I couldn't do it because I got appendicitis.
Oh no.
I was and I was it was just like you I was in my hospital bed just like calling the director and says, please don't recast it. I can do it. I can do the jumping around and the sword fighting. And oh God, no, it hurts. It hurts. It hurts. So that was one of my big regrets, was that I never actually got to be in that production of Romeo and Juliet. So what now in a way I kind of like I got to do it myself. So that's kind of like
That's true. I love recuperative storytelling like that, restoring time. It really captures the spirit too of being a theater kid and you know, caring so much about
Oh yeah.
productions. And oh my gosh, and just all the interpersonal drama, because you have a lot of people who feel things very intensely.
Yes. First of all, like they're young, first of all, and they're theater kids.
Yes.
So it's Jesus. Looking back, I mean, I loved it so much, but I was miserable all the time. It's just like it's the weirdest thing. It's a wonder no one was murdered. It really is.
It really, really was. And I remember in particular, in high school too, like, at parties, like I would, you leave the room to use the restroom for 2 minutes and you come back and everybody has arranged the chairs into a circle and they're all talking about their feelings. And it's like, oh gosh, like what transpired while I was gone? Like, so many feelings, so many feelings.
I didn't get invited to parties in high school, so I can't speak to that. But I'll take your word for it.
Only theater kid parties, none of the actually cool kid parties, but we did what we could. Um, could you talk a little bit about how you use folklore here? Because now that I know that you studied it, you have a really probably deep knowledge of it. And I'm wondering, like, when you are as deep as it can be.
Oh, please don't quiz me. Please don't quiz me.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm wondering, like, when you're using folklore and applying it to a fictional story, how do you sort of like where do you start the fiction, like where do you keep the core of the folklore, and where do you do you shift things a little bit for the purposes of your modern storytelling, or like what
Yeah.
is the relationship to the source material, I guess?
Well, so this is what I have to like. I actually have a disclaimer at the back of the book, basically saying if you're interested in Irish folklore, here's a list of books to read. On that list of books is not the one you've just read, because no, I mean I cheat a lot. I was creating my own story, and where the existing stories and where the existing lore didn't didn't fit that, I created from whole cloth, and like this is what all storytellers do. You don't There is no canon with these. There's kind of like we every time you tell the story, it gets remade, and it's all they're constantly being remade for the modern day, and to reflect the anxieties and of the current time. That's how folklore works. It's not these aren't scripture. They're not biblical texts. They can change. They do change. They will change again. Um, but yeah, I invented a lot. I did invent a lot. The whole thing about the rings, the Morgan rings, complete invention. The the whole like the role of the puka is you kind of, I mean, yeah, there's some depictions of him as a goat. There is kind of like some connection to kind of like to changelings, but it's very kind of like loosey goosey. um so yeah, so I basically I would say rather these I'm drawing on the stories rather than just kind of like retelling them, if that makes sense. Like obviously, like as I said, like Mockin Down and the Hoggart is a big influence on the story, but the story goes in a very, very different direction than that original story. So yeah, it's just kind of like I draw on it, but I don't. It's not a retelling. It is very much. It's kind of like a lot of it is kind of like my own invention.
I mean, in a way, I think that sort of is like a more authentic relationship to folklore, because as you say, it is this like living, breathing thing. And it's a lot more local, I think, than we tend to give it credit for, much more localized, because in a way, like when people were writing down these stories, like maybe in the 19th or early 20th century, like that that did like ossify them in a way that never was really intended for those stories. Like they
Yeah,
were meant to live and change like over the years. And so
yeah,
in a way, this kind of honors like what folklore is in a way.
yeah. It's no, that's the kind of like that's the great kind of like tension with folklore, because this is so weird. I was actually just writing something about this today, but part of the reason why Ireland has the largest and most complete kind of like body of still extant Celtic mythology is because it was written down, because we actually got writing. Like the Gauls, like they were still like pre-literate before the Romans came, so they kind of like their culture was just gone. Like we know nothing about virtually anything we know about Gaulish mythology and religion. It just comes to us in snippets from the Romans, and they're kind of like, oh yeah, this god was kind of like I mean, he was basically Apollo, that's all we get. Whereas with the Irish stuff, because the monks actually came and actually wrote it down, we still have all this. So that is a wonderful thing. But at the same time, it does kind of like change the nature of the stories, because they, as you say, they do kind of like get ossified, and that's why it's a lot the oral tradition, which is when I was studying the folklore department. They had the kind of like this massive archive of stories that have been recorded from like, and this is in the book. There is a like Ashling and Betty, they go on a collecting mission to interview an old storyteller, and that is kind of like you get this incredibly varied, incredibly rich kind of like body of always kind of like changing oral tradition.
Something that really stuck with me, I think, is from a lecture scene where a professor who's talking about folklore says that, oh gosh, did I write it down? Oh yeah, that folklore puts a face on that which cannot be faced. And in that way, I think like folklore almost operates a lot like the horror genre does, because so much of horror is
Hmm.
about putting a face on that which can't be faced. And I know for me personally, as someone who tends toward baseless anxiety, like in my daily life, like I love reading horror because it gives me something specific to be scared of for a while. It's like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
not scared of like the world. I'm scared of this ghost, and
Yeah.
that's very comforting.
Why would you even be scared? I've never understood why people are scared of ghosts. It's like,
Yeah.
what would it do? It's like, it's literally, it's the most harmless. It can't touch you.
Yeah.
Relax.
Yeah. Yeah. I would try to befriend it, I think, eventually after the shock, but like, yeah, it is like I really love that horror does that. Like it gives us sort of like a way to process things that are like not processable, and I think you see that in the way that trauma operates in this story too, like sort of on, the personal level of things happening to individuals that then affects like their families, but also kind of on a national level. Like I was fascinated by one of the folklore bits that you talk about hungry grass and how that sort of relates to like specific things in Irish history that where fears were very much connected to like these stories. Is that something that you kind of you thought about while writing? Or
That was, well, the hungry grass sequence actually came about because my mother knows someone that happened to.
oh wow.
Um, yeah, so that was kind of just for so the phenomenon of hungry grass is basically it's supposedly if you can step on a patch of ground, a just completely innocuous patch of ground, and you just be overcome with this terrible crippling sense of hunger. And the story goes that this is somewhere where someone died during the famine.
Mhm.
um so I like I think like a lot of Irish people, I'm kind of like, my head is kind of like a Schrodinger's cat when it kind of comes to this stuff. Like, you don't believe it, but you do believe it, and this is like anything, like my wife, who's kind of like a died in the wool atheist, like the most skeptical person you'll ever meet. She would not step into a fairy ring if you put a gun to her head. um so it's like it's a weird kind of mindset, but that's just kind of how we're wired here. You just that there are things you don't do.
Mhm.
um but yeah, but anyway, that was kind of like that was the it like, just because I thought it was a very kind of like effective kind of way of bringing, but also it's just kind of like, I've had that story in my head since I was a child. Like, my mother like vividly described this thing happening to her friend, and how I will always remember, she had a packet of what we call crisps, or like potato chips. You just happen to have a packet of potato chips in her pocket, and that's what saved her. Which is that was able to kind of like to sustain her until she was able to just crawl out of that place, and just kind of like that's what you get. An Irish childhood is like, just kind of like, yes, just hearing these kind of like stories. But yeah, so that's kind of like it. The book was very much just kind of like just taking all of that kind of like stuff that I grew up with, and my own kind of like life and my own kind of experience, and just kind of like just putting it into one novel.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so sorry, I have a tendency to ramble. I'm sorry, just cut me off when I start getting too.
I love it. It's the best thing that you can do for an interviewer is just keep talking. It's great. So,
Fair
but
enough, fair enough.
I do find that really fascinating. That there are things that appeal to us as true on an intellectual level, and then there are things I think that appeal to us on an emotional level as true. And that's absolutely at work with, I think, folklore, and I think maybe like the way that we generally relate to things that we encountered as children when we remember
Mhm.
them as adults.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Are you working on anything else at the moment? What else are you
Um,
doing?
I'm working on a few different projects. So I've got a few kind of like children's books in the works. The first one is tentatively due to come out in spring of 2025. I'm working on a project that for a publisher I don't think I can talk about, and I'm working on a high fantasy novel.
Ooh.
Um, and I think that's everything that I can talk about. But yeah, I've got a few things in the pipeline.
That's great. Well, maybe you can come back someday and talk about those projects because this was
I
a
would be delighted. Thank you so much.
no problem. Yeah, this is a lovely conversation, and I'm very excited to see what you do next. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you so much for reading the book.
Well, you're welcome. Listeners, please check out Knock Knock Open Wide. By the time that you hear this episode, it will be out in the world. So please check it out at your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go get your books. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.